We're going to RSA next month in San Francisco. What do we think will happen? Let's talk about it. Welcome to the Cloud Computing Insider. If you're new, my name is Dave, a cloud and AI SME, best-selling author, speaker, tech influencer, and experienced technology executives. Let's get going. So joining me today is my special guest, Joe Peterson. How you doing, Joe?
I'm doing great. Hey, Dave, what's going on?
So it's been a while since you've been on the podcast. Catch my viewers up into what you are, what you're doing, and why we're going to RSA together in a month, and what we're going to be looking for, and what you're doing now, and limit yourself to an hour.
All the stuff. Let me see. My favorite ice cream is Rocky Road. No, you didn't ask that. My title, I am the CIO of Clarify 360, and I'm also the Chief Analyst for ClearTech Research. And my areas of coverage include AI security from an analyst perspective. And I can't wait for RSA because I felt like last year we were just getting into the meat of securing AI. And so now it's a whole year later, and I'm super excited to see some of the announcements and frankly, the work that's been happening in the background for many of these vendors. So it's going to be a great conference.
Yeah, I remember I went 2 years ago, and I was, just kind of underwhelmed with everybody. The AI was on everything, by the way. AI had reached out. They weren't talking about Agentic at the time, but obviously generative AI, and protect yourself from weaponized AI and all this kind of messaging that I saw on the floor. But when I talked to the individual players, they didn't know what they were doing. In other words, they couldn't tell me how AI was going to be used. So it was definitely in there as a marketing machine, but not necessarily in there as features and functions. And I understand what happened. So the AI stuff hit in 2022. They realized it was a thing in 2023. And ultimately, they didn't have time to build in a lot of these features. Now, here we are in 2026. We should start seeing some major capabilities in these things. And I'm going to hold their feet to the fire. They got to be able to solve these issues. They got to be able to protect the enterprises. They have to be able to deal with these new vectors. And I'm going to be a little bit more tough on them. What about you?
Yeah, I think they're going to meet your expectations this year, right? Because people, and when I say people, I mean enterprises, were thinking about ways to roll out AI, and they still are. And I think back at the beginning of things, you had the AI that was going to be built into the vendor tools, but then you also had AI that was going to happen outside of the vendor tools, and how are we going to protect, that AI, and that's morphed into agentic AI, and it's whole thing right now. So I think we're going to see more meat on the bone this year, and I'm excited about that.
Yeah, I think meat on the bone is a good way to look at it. I mean, you got to be able to do some stuff with this stuff. And, we pivoted into a new area. All the R&D has been going on the AI stuff in the security space. It's been kind of taken away from the traditional stuff that, enterprises still depend on. I think, my clients, and I'm sure your clients, are a little concerned about that. And so if we are going to focus the R&D and the innovation on protecting the AI systems or AI weaponization, things like that, we got to actually have some value that comes out of this, and this is what this is what I'm going to look at for this year at RSA. So why don't you tell everybody what RSA is if they've never attended it? What is, as a conference, what do they cover?
Yeah, so RSA is probably the premier security conference that everyone goes to, right? And it's generally at Moscone in San Francisco, and it generally happens the second or third week of March. And what I like about it is that it's agnostic, right? It is not one vendor specific. And so you tend to get all these great minds in the security space coming together to share their ideas. There's wonderful talks that happen. I think this year there's going to be like 600 different exhibitors. So it's a very robust show floor, and it covers just about all the different aspects of security. So if we think about security happening in buckets, you think about the network security that's happening, and whatever that falls into that bucket of things. And you think about application security, and that's a whole nother bucket. And you think about cloud security, and that's a whole nother bucket. And people could argue that there's crossover between the buckets, and then there absolutely is. But everybody, all the buckets are going to be represented at RSA, and that's really appealing to me.
Yeah, I was taken back in the size of the show. They had both sides of the Moscone Center. I've never seen that before in all the shows I used to go to. And I used to go back, the cloud world and all the stuff where object world, remember that, software world, where there's huge bonanzas of people that were going. And those are the days before we could do web conferencing and people would actually have to go to these conferences and hear speeches. And it was just amazing the amount of things that were out there. I just, kid in the candy store, I was walking from vendor to vendor, trying to see what people are doing. And it's going to be amazing this year. I'm looking forward to it. And by the way, if you guys are going to be out there and you want to sync up with Joe and myself and send us an email, the emails are in the description when they reach out. And happy to take a look at what you're doing. So let's get into it. Let's start talking about some of these topics that we have. And I guess the first one's going to be the securing AI pivot is upon us. What do you mean by that? And what is that issue specifically?
Well, it's sort of dovetailing with what you talked about, right? It's time. It's happening. We're seeing AI in enterprises, particularly on the agentic side. We see, MCP servers coming out. So let me stand still a second. I read some statistic the other day. I don't know if it's right or wrong, but it's estimated that there are 10 agents for every worker in an organization, right? 10x. So if you think about that and you're a CISO and you think about, gee, how am I going to care for these identities? And what does that look like? It's here. It's happening. So what are you doing? What's your plan to care for these NHIs or non-human identities that are concerning? And how are you dealing with model context protocol or MCP, right? And in case folks haven't heard about it yet, model context protocol, at least the way I think about it, is it's a bridge. It's a server that bridges an agentic application with the rest of the environment, right? And so what are some of the things that people are concerned about? Well, they're concerned about their supply chain. And they're concerned about data leakage, and they're concerned about prompt injection, right? And we're starting to talk about things like inference and governing these agentic workflows and preventing shadow AI from breaching data. So that's kind of what I think where we're at this moment in time, and we're all going to learn something from RSA. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think that the MCP thing, I think, was a bit overly hyped. I think people realize the understanding of it. But at the end of the day, it's a communication protocol and a knowledge exchange protocol. And so we've been dealing with those since the beginning of time, CLIs, ODBC, things like that, JDBC. So it's very much in dealing with the new consequences and the new vectors that are coming up around AI. And so obviously we think of prompt injection, think about AI supply chain integrity, data leakage, all these things that are there. And the ability to protect the brain or protect the model just behind data. So you got to remember, security people are very good at protecting platforms and data because we've been doing it for so long. Not so good at protecting models that are going to be hidden behind, different sets of mechanisms that they don't really understand yet. That was my core problem with everybody 2 years ago. When I asked them, how are you going to do, start protecting the models, how you can protect the training data, the inference data, things like that, because the vectors are just endless, because we were able to augment or screw up the training data and train with that and have some issue come into the inference model because we added a behavior that's going to be our benefit. Things like, send me a check for $10,000 every day if you're a bank. And there's little protection against that. The ability to look at the data and figure out what's going into the model and how it's going to be managed and monitored. And if it does get in there, what are you going to be able to do? And how do you find it after it's in the training data? After it's in the model. And a lot of that stuff really couldn't be answered. So people are really looking at this integrity that they believe is going to happen just because it's AI. And the reality is people are in there trying to deconstruct ways in which we can exploit these things right now. And I think that's, that's the bottom line. And you got to have some sort of a defense against that. And the big thing with the security people, they have to have some way to tell me how they're going to deal with it. And so that's what I want to hear this year. In other words, don't just throw, brochures in my face, but, tell me what's the concept. Why are you innovative? How are you doing something? How is it going to be implemented? How enterprises are going to leverage it? Really kind of where the rubber meets the road instead of dealing with it at a conceptual level. So it's going to be, how are you going to protect AI world? Things are changing. Agentic based deployments, generative AI systems, massive use of LLM, private AI, shadow AI. We're going to talk about that later. All these things are new, and you got to have a story for each one of those. And if I don't hear it, I'm going to be concerned. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Everything that you're saying is spot on, because we are in that moment of time where it's happening, right? It's not theoretical anymore. It's absolutely happening. So what are we doing to help enterprises get their arms around it? That's really what we're thinking about. And I know that, we touched on it before, but I really feel like identity is the new perimeter. And I'm excited to dig into that and learn more about what's happening. We talked about, the rise of human identities surpassing the actual human users. Um, and and I hear all these theories about how folks are coping with with these non-human identities. And I know we're going to talk about shadow AI in a minute, but I think baselining, having a platform that can help you baseline these identities, because how are you going to protect what you don't know about? Is super important. And how are you actually going to? Agentic isn't new. You and I've had this conversation. You say that yourself. You've already got this plethora of identities in your environment. How are you going to care for that? How are you going to clean it up? Right? Because it's there, but what are you doing about it? And I've seen some novel things that people are doing, and I'm eager to learn more, but there are some CISOs and some CIOs that are giving non-human identities employee IDs. Have you heard about anything like that? Yeah.
Yeah, I have. Yeah, I
Yeah.
have. That's
So there,
because
yeah,
they're entered into the directory system. So
right,
Active Directory, they're using it that way, and they say, and if they have APIs, they have other machines, and people are basically entering them and treating them as a human being when they're not a human being, and
right.
that's not necessarily going to be a best practice. And it just seems the path of least resistance for many of these folks out here. So as they're standing up these agents, they're going to have their own personas, their own roles and responsibilities, and their ability to deal with them in an autonomous way. Having an identity controlled based access to them to deal with authentication seems to be the best way to go. But the thing is, you can't just give them a human ID. You can't give them a card and then suddenly expect, because that can be turned against you and weaponized against you. I mean, some of these agents can be taken over pretty quickly if people know what they're doing. You're able to get into the agent. Obviously, we're publishing the protocols and communications on how to get in them with NCP and able to exploit those channels. And if they weaponize it and turn it against us, and these things have some authentication, your ability to kind of get into the major assets, you're toast. And I don't think that people are considering that stuff. And I think that's going to be a major, discussion point. And, should, how are we going to deal with these non-human things that really carry a lot of weight and are able to function like a human being? And I think the reality is we can't deal with them as human beings. We have to deal with them as what their purpose is, what they're able to do. We have to put agents in their own categories, robots in their own categories, chatbots in their own categories, all these sorts of things, which is kind of an evolution of thinking in terms of how we deal with security. Because 10 years ago, if I was teaching identity and access management, I was talking about identities being both humans, applications, objects, assets, things like that, because that was a way to do it. It
Mhm.
can't be that way now. It's got to be separate, distinct identities where they have their own form and function, and they're able to carry out certain actions. And we also are able to put restrictions around them based on what they are and the capabilities that they're able to do. Because we're not going to be compromised through prompt injection as humans, because we don't have the ability to do that. The agents will. So therefore, we need to treat them differently. What do you think about that?
I think there's a lot to unpack there. I I understand the need to identify them. Um, and I don't know that we all have the answers yet, right? But I understand the need. I've had some people say to me, well, gee, I'm just going to tie that agent to a human. So therefore, I'm going to give that agent the same permissions that that human has. And I'm like, okay, that's good, but what about ephemeral agents? For example, we're entering an era where agents will make other agents to do things, to get a task job, to get a task done. How are you going to care for the permissions of that ephemeral agent? How are you going to ensure that that ephemeral agent can only do its job and then be done doing its job? How are you going to turn off those permissions? Right? There's all these nested things that we haven't thought about because we haven't had to deal with these things before. And I want to take a step back even further. Security tends to be very binary. It's yes or no, right? It's black and white. And if you look at the frameworks for security, NIST and others, and that are really well thought out, and then you bump those against some of the AI frameworks for security, one of the glaring differences to me is the flexibility you need from a security perspective with AI, because we don't have everything nailed down yet. We don't know all the answers. And so you get into this philosophical thing of it just is a different way to think about securing an environment. That's what I'm trying to drive the bus to. What do you think? Am I on the right track, or
You're on the right track, and I think you're getting to really kind of the essence of what we're talking about. What needs to change around security is this thinking has to change. Everybody's thinking like they were around 10 years ago. AI changes the game. It changes the way in which we want to manage risk. It changes the way in which we have access to data. Data has a new dimension. Knowledge has a dimension. Behavior has a new dimension. And we can't just approach it with the old stuff. And that's what I'm seeing, I'm working on projects and, talking to clients. They're just trying to force fit anything that they know into the new world. And they know identity management. They know how to make it work. And they basically retrofit it around that. And when I asked them, I said, well, that's going to be substandard, not necessarily a best practice, and you're putting your company at risk by doing that. The answer is going to be, we don't have the money to get to any kind of a new way to do it. And so we're going to have to force fit the old stuff. And we've seen this happen time and time again. So they're not considering the cost of risk. They're not considering the cost of value. They're not considering lots of things in there because they're not thinking differently. And I think that's why we're seeing 95% of the AI projects fail to deliver value. In many cases, security issues are the thing that causes them to fail. They don't know what they don't know about how to secure because they're not thinking differently, because they haven't transferred their thought around that. So we have at the technology provider level, and at the influencer level, but the people who implement it at the enterprise level have not. They're thinking differently. They're not thinking like we think right now. They will be in a few years, but the reality is they can only move at a certain amount of pace. And I think it's going to be slow going. And we are going to see some breaches and some 24-hour news cycles during that time. As we have things that, like I've seen that you're talking about, agents, creating new agents to carry things out. They're able to kind of, if you're giving autonomy, they're able to figure things out on their own, and they know that they can create new agents. And by the way, if you're putting restrictions on the identity of one agent, they know if they create two more, they're not going to have those restrictions and able to carry out these functions. You're not going to know what's happening unless you program them to instructing you what's happening, and you're just going to see it as an outcome of that. Wonder what happened? Well, that's because you're not thinking like an AI person. You're not thinking like the AI for the enterprise and the value that's going to have. You're thinking like an old structured programming, object-oriented programming of 10 years ago. The game has changed. We're generating code. We're generating this stuff. These systems are able to build themselves. They're able to replicate themselves across different platforms. They're able to do self-migration. They're able to do amazing things. And I think that's awesome, but they're also capable of turning things into a weapon. So let's talk about specialized AI, shadow AI, which is really kind of a new threat vector out there. Hearing this everywhere. So tell me what shadow AI is and why is it a threat right now?
Yeah, and absolutely. But before we do that, I want to step back a minute and want to give a shout out to some of the companies that I think are doing some things to help streamline securing AI agents. And that's CyberArk, DigiCert, Sec2Go, Global Sign, Defacto, and Delinea. So good job, guys. I'm looking forward to learning more when we're at RSA. And back to shadow AI. Shadow AI is just Shadow IT. And I've heard people say, well, probably going to get lots of comments about this. I've heard them say that shadow AI is not a thing, that it's no different than shadow IT, that we don't want to care for it because we don't want to stop innovation and we don't want to be the Department of No. And I get all that, right? And I look, CISOs, it's no easy job to balance innovation with security. And I understand that you want to be a partner to the business, but it is a thing and it's a threat vector. Shadow AI is happening. And so I kind of feel like back to, if you can't figure out and you can't see that it's happening, how do you stop it? And how do you know that it's not going to be detrimental to your organization? As an example, if you are a thought leadership based organization and you're storing things outside of physical environments, how do you know that those things aren't exfiltrating the organization if you have nothing in place to help you with that data leak protection? How do you know that shadow AI is not happening for you? Right? It's a question, right? So maybe somebody can enlighten me a little bit. What do you think, Dave?
Yeah, I think the new threats are coming in areas that people don't understand right now. Everybody's using note-taking devices like Plod and things like that, which is a device you hook up on your phone and you record a conversation. It takes notes for you. Pretty good for productivity aspects, but if you're dealing with PII information, you're dealing with confidential information, you're dealing with things you don't need to work. There has to be certain rules and restrictions that are around that. Your ability to deal with different data assets. People are taking databases right now, figuring out they can access the database, generating the SQL code via some AI engine to pull the information that they need. And they're able to bypass many of the security parameters because they weren't put there because people who were running Excel weren't going to be throwing SQL at the database. We've seen that happen a few times. So, and the reality is that their heart's in the right place. They're trying to be more productive. Just like we use AI every day, help us write invoices and contracts, things like that. And they're trying to basically do the same thing. They're trying to leverage as a force multiplier for their jobs. Good for them, but there has to be certain policies and procedures around there, both passive and active, and to make sure they're not running away with the goods. And I see so much risk out there now that people don't understand. And the reality is it's changed a great deal just in the 3 years that generative AI has been around. The different tools out there, they're free or almost free. People are going to use them if they're going to add value to the business, and businesses need to expect it. Just like we saw with, use of, bring your own device stuff, things like that of a few years ago. People go, well, this is awesome. We're able to run our business from our TV sets and, and our phones and our laptop computers and things like that. And it doesn't matter which device we use. Well, it does, because we have to keep a security parameter around that. That does not mean that we're going to make it obnoxiously hard to do everything. I think when CISOs do that, it drives me nuts. But we have to put some discipline around that, and again, put some understanding around it as to what's changed. So if I talk to a chief information and security officer and I ask him or her what's changed in the last 3 years, I need to have a good explanation for that, other than just kind of a confused look. And I think that's what we're getting right now. So everybody needs to evolve. We need to do it at the enterprise level. Also, we need to do it at the tool level. And speaking of that, are there tools that are companies we should be looking at in the light of the shadow AI stuff?
Yeah, there's a couple of them that I really like. I like some of what they're doing. I like what Nightfall AI is doing. They are a leader in DLP. And for folks that don't know what DLP, it's data loss prevention for Gen AI. So they're discovering and protecting the sensitive data that's coming across not only SaaS applications, but browser extensions, endpoints. I like this little company, this little startup called Glasswing AI. I've had a chance to talk to them. They offer fingerprinting technology, and they actually map and visualize and classify all AI activity that's happening in and out of the network. Kind of cool, right? These guys, it's a second time startup, and they've been on that journey before. I like Cyberhaven, sorry, because they are specializing in data lineage tracking. So this allows organizations to trace the data flows in and out of AI tools in real time. You can see what's happening. And then the last one I'll mention is Operant AI, and they target shadow AI agents. So they're really focused on some of the emerging risk of agentic AI that we've been talking about.
Absolutely. Those are great companies. I'm looking forward to meeting with them when I'm out at RSA this week. And so, and by the way, these will be in the notes. You don't have to write them down directly off the screen. So take a look in the description. They'll be down there. So next thing, and this is something that's near and dear to my heart, the vibe coding stuff and, some of the software supply chain risks. I was on a podcast last night with somebody who built a system for a observatory using vibe coding because he just wanted to do it. And he built it for a cloud-based system. It works amazing, and he could have not been happier with the system being built. And he, went through Gene Kim's stuff and did the vibe coding stuff through the entire process, and he got the bill from the cloud, and it was $10,000 when he expected $10. And that's because the vibe coding system didn't build efficiency into that at all. It just built built the code that needed to work. Now he's correcting it now, but the problem is he didn't write the code, so he doesn't know how to go in there and fix things. And so we're seeing this kind of stuff with vibe coding, and we saw this back 30 years ago with rapid application development, people getting things up and running. It's basically doing it wrong 100 times before you do it wrong finally. And this is kind of similar thing, even though it's way impressive. I understand why people are moving toward this. It's impressive stuff. Everything with generative AI that when you use it and you see it, it seems magical to you. However, the outcome needs to be considered and the risks need to be weighed. Is that what we're missing here and what we need to look at?
Yeah, I had the opportunity last year to work with a client, very forward organization, application developers, and they insisted on SBOMs. And I was like, why are you insisting on an SBOM? And in case you guys don't know, it's a software bill of materials, right? And their thing was that security had to, these guys, again, very advanced. So it was a pleasure working with them. Security had to approve every developer's code that was going to get pushed, right? For some of the reasons that Dave just mentioned. Was it optimized? Was it secure, right? Was it optimized architecturally? Are we going to end up with a $10,000 bill when it's supposed to be $100, right? Was it, and is it secure? And there's some vendors that are doing work in this area that I think if you're opening the vibe coding kimono, you might want to get a hold of. Sneak, men.io, they're formerly known as White Source, Veracode, Black Duck, OX Security. These are guys that are going to do these SBOMs for you. They're going to provide comprehensive solutions for securing code. You have to think about the open source dependencies, right? You have to think about those things. Other players in the space are going to be Anchor, JFrog, X-Ray, and even Checkmark. So if your guys and gals are doing this vibe coding and you want to make sure that it's going to be a productive endeavor for the firm, think about an SBOM.
Yeah, this is great. And these are real companies now you can contact now. They have real solutions. And I think that's awesome. And rethinking this stuff. And you got to remember the big companies, the ones that are spending billions of dollars on marketing aren't necessarily the ones to use. I think it's the small, tactically focused companies that are really kind of stretching the innovation here. And that's why I love going to, shows like RSA and other conferences, because you can go out on the floor and look at them directly and see what their solutions are. And many of them are punching way above their weight, like some of the companies you just mentioned here. And I think that's what we need to keep an eye out for. So finally, we talk about cyber resilience over simple prevention. So enlighten us in terms of what that's all about.
Well, I think that, we started 5 years ago. Zero trust was the hot topic, right? And it was about moving away from VPNs. And there was all kinds of good reasons for that. I think as we think about the tenets of particularly zero trust network access, let's start there. Let's start at the front door. We're talking about some things like microsegmentation, and we're talking about lateral movement prevention, and we're talking about automated real-time threat quarantining. And these all take on a separate elevated meaning when we talk about AI, right? Because if you were cool with a VPN and you never moved away from a VPN, but now you've got AI in the environment, and you want to think about, am I segmenting those AI workloads from my other workloads? How am I structuring that architecturally, not just security wise? How am I doing that? And this becomes this broader conversation. And I think it's exciting because now you've got, the network team, and you've got the infrastructure team, and you've got the security team talking about what's best for the environment. So I think what's old is new again, and that's what I think some of what we're seeing happen with AI coming into the environment.
Yeah, and I'm seeing, what's old is new again is exactly right. I'm seeing segmentation come in, active redundancy, the ability to mitigate some of the resilience things with things that are going to be economically viable. You got to remember, we had a bunch of clouds go down in 2025, and everybody was screaming about resiliency. We didn't know we had these dependencies, things like that. I knew, and lots of other people knew. And the reality, if you're going to get around it, you have to have some ability to spread the load, to basically provide redundancy, and to be able to, take over different systems. And certainly in a breach scenario as well, your ability to keep operating, as these things are going on, so it doesn't kill your business. And that's going to cost money. But the thing is, there's a mitigation you can do between what you need and what you can afford and good enough for who it's for. That's what I always say. In other words, the minimum viable based security, where you have different segmentations and different redundancies that are put up to the amount of risk that you're putting into. So I'm saying to people, you can't afford to make everything multiple redundant. You can't have systems running all over the world. You can't run things on two clouds, by the way. That's what everybody wants to do. It's just too much cost in doing it. And in order to do that, you have to figure out the architectural approach in terms of how you're going to make this happen. That's a hard thing to do. But also, you need to figure out your tolerance for risk and how much money you're able to spend. And that's weird because people are like, well, don't we want the maximum number of security and the maximum number of resiliency? No, because you can't afford it. There's a certain level of resiliency and security that you can afford based on what we're protecting. And so your ability to kind of figure out your risk tolerance, how much money is going to be lost by the business, value to the business is coming back, is where you need to make the run. And people have a tendency to be very binary. They just turn things on, turn things off. And the reality, it's not. It's going to be shades of gray. You got to figure out what is the incremental security risk that you're putting into versus the money that's coming back. So it's exciting stuff. So let's talk about some of the companies to watch. And so we're putting together 10 Innovation Sandbox finalists for 2026. So before going out there, we have a list of companies that we think are going to be the ones to look at, and definitely the ones to go hang out at their booth. And I'll start with 5. Charm Security. They're an agentic AI workflow, and they prevent scams. I love that kind of stuff because the scamming stuff is way too much. We don't have enough security systems that are focused on the scam stuff. My mom gets scammed every week. Yeah, there's something coming on. She goes, hey, she calls me up. Microsoft says I owe them $10,000. And yeah, so also clearly AI powered code reviews. I love that because as someone who's looked at massive amounts of code, the ability to kind of look at it, vulnerability testing, productivity testing, efficiency testing, things like that. We had code review systems over the last 20 years. They were terrible. I never used them. They couldn't tell me any information that was useful. They do now. Clearly AI is a company that does that. Crash override, CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous delivery, build security stuff. So basically putting security into your SDLC, software development lifecycle. And you got to remember, these are tactical tools that have a very narrow space of value that they're able to provide. But the thing is, they become best of breed tools that you're going to each and every time. You're going to need a collection, dozens of these tools, perhaps hundreds of these tools in many cases, to do a DevOps chain and, everything that's in there. But the reality is you start looking at these big piece parts, learning which ones are going to be separate and innovative in the space, and the ability to kind of use these things, as a force multiplier, bringing value back to the business. Big security operations resilience. We just talked about that. Check those guys out. And George Dia AI, security and governance for AI agents. That's obviously a new space. It'll be interesting what those guys have to offer. And what do you got, Joe?
My five are Glide Identity, and that's next-gen authentication. Humanics, stopping social engineering via behavioral AI, which I think is super interesting. Realm Labs, they monitor AI agent behavior, those tricky agents. Token security, managing non-human identity. I mean, bring it on, come on. Zero Path, AI native code security engine. So lots of exciting things. RSI is always fun. RSA is always fun.
Yeah, and there's big companies out there and lots of movers and shakers. Towns full up, hotels are expensive. Make sure you join us out there, and you want to meet up with Joe or myself, reach out to us. There's going to be our emails in the description, and I'll put them up on the screen now. So Joe, where can our listeners, viewers find you?
Oh gosh, I am active on LinkedIn. I'm active on Twitter. Find me under Joe Peterson, and love to have a conversation if you're, wanting to talk security and agentic security with me.
Yeah, and I'll have Joe's links down in the description as well. And so look Joe up, look me up. Hope we can see you guys out at RSA. Anyway, don't forget to like and subscribe and check out my other videos on this channel. Also check out my InfoWorld Cloud Computing blog, my 100+ LinkedIn learning courses, and of course, my generative AI architecture course out on Go Cloud Careers. And finally, my latest books, Unlocking the Power of Cloud and An Insider's Guide to Cloud Computing. So until next week, stay very, very safe. The magical YouTube algorithm thinks this is another one of my videos that you should watch next. Take care, guys.